Welcome to another episode of Home Again TV. This episode, we will focus on Martin Luther King, specifically the Martin Luther King libraries and how it made an impact on the African American community. Hello, everyone. Hello. Did you like our introduction? Hopefully you guys can hear me well. I am outdoors. Please give me some indication if there's a problem with sound. But I'm standing outside of the old Martin Luther King Library that was built in 1969 that I actually grew up attending. It was one of those places that children went to because they felt safe. It was a place in time in the 70s where children and libraries were just becoming popular amongst African Americans. And I asked a question on Facebook a couple of weeks ago, I should say just last week. And I was wondering if libraries impacted your life the way they did mine. And it appeared that it did because I just asked the simple question, what library affected or what library did you attend as a child? And I'm going to give some of those answers regarding some of the people that made comments. Keith Allen Bozeman said, of course, MLK. And I'm going to just talk about the people who attended Martin Luther King. And then in a couple of minutes, I'll talk about other people who attended other libraries in the community or in other communities. Ken Stanley, hey, yeah, you would have gone to Martin Luther King. He lived right down the street. We had Danny Hooks, who went to Martin Luther King as well as the main library downtown. I didn't frequent the main library as a child. I'm trying to remember, did I even know that there was a main library? I mean, to me, as a child, this was my main library. So I don't even know if I even thought about a big main library downtown. Just being honest. Gail, of course, went to MLK. April Cook frequented Carl Road and MLK. Melissa Favors, who also went to East High School. Many of these people were residents of the East Side. But I do know, I think Melissa lived on the West Side. Do you know that, Bobby? Melissa Favors? I think she was on the South Side or the West Side, but she frequented here. Inga Clark, she went to Martin Luther King. And of course, I've got to give the answer from one of my relatives because he never just answers the question. He has to give an explanation of the question. My cousin Troy, he says, I was mostly confined to my room, but I had books there and I was always reading. I once read the entire stack of encyclopedias that we had at the top of the stairs outside of my room. It took me all of 2 months to read them all. I also read a lot in the library at my school. So I wanted to talk about this topic because reading was huge for me as a child. Education was big for me. But not only for me, obviously for other people, just like my cousin Troy. Reading became a huge opportunity for African American children when I was growing up, because the reason why we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about it a little more, is that it wasn't always accessible to African Americans. So that's why we're stopping and having this conversation today. One of the other reasons that we're having this conversation is that our culture that we currently live in is created of an education system that sometimes misses teaching about the past. And libraries became a staple for connection, a staple for relationship, a connection place for people to learn more about who they are and more about the world. It became a place that African Americans felt safe in. Just so that I can show you guys just a little more about we're going to talk a little bit more about the local experience of the libraries in Columbus, Ohio. But I'm going to send you to a clip to give you a quick indication of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm standing outside of the new Martin Luther King Library that is located on the corner of Taylor and Long. What's significant about this library is this is actually the third Martin Luther King Library that's located on the east side of Columbus. What's cool is that this location, when it was built last year in 2018, it was a recreation of the original Martin Luther King Library that was established in 1953. The second Martin Luther King Library was established in 1969, and we're going to take a little journey, which is a couple of blocks down the street. We're currently in the 1400 block. The second Martin Luther King Library was located at the 1600 block. What I think is pretty significant, not only about the library, is that both libraries was dedicated by the Martin Luther King family. In 1969, the second Martin Luther King Library was dedicated by Martin Luther King Sr. And then just last year in 2018, the new Martin Luther King Library was dedicated by Martin Luther King III. So I think that type of stuff is pretty cool. Not to mention that the second library that was built in 1969 was none other than your girl's library that I frequented all the time, and I have lots of good stories about it. Pretty cool, right? I mean, sometimes we stop understanding history because it isn't relatable to a time that we were born, but it was pretty cool to learn that in 1953 there was an original Martin Luther King Library, because again, since I've been born in 1969, this was the library that I related to, and I thought that was the only Martin Luther King Library. So it's pretty cool when you understand history, you understand why it was positioned that way, and now we understand why the new library was put in a new location or in the original location. So when we understand things in our past, again, we understand the development into our future. That's why I'm here to talk about the history in the community that African Americans grew up in. Somebody's got to do it, y'all. That was pretty cool though, right? Now also let's talk about how the library experience has impacted you. Can you tell a story, or do you remember a story or a period in time when attending the library was impactful in your life? Please share that story with your friends or the people online in the timeline. Again, we want to continue to spread the good news about being an African American, and reading and learning and education wasn't always accessible to us. So we have to stop and recognize that period, because we're no longer in that state. We do have opportunities where we can attend all of the libraries. We're not discriminated against, but we have to recognize and share these stories with our children so that they can learn to appreciate and why it is that I appreciate the library. I have to tell you guys a little short story. I thought the library has always been a cool place. I grew up in it. It was a safe place. It was a place that I learned, and we'll talk a little bit later about one of the reasons why I frequent there. But what was more valuable to me now as an adult is I tried to apply at the library. I just thought it would be, you know, something interesting to have as a job. I can read, I can get updated on historical facts. It is not easy to find a job at the library. So again, I'm still learning the significance of a library, even when it pertains to their human resources. So we don't want to do anything without explaining why it is that we're having the conversation about historical facts, African Americans, libraries, reading, and education. So I want to make sure that you understand why it is that we are stopping and recognizing Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King's libraries, because they played a huge part in our community as we grew as African Americans. I don't want to give away a lot of the information, but I want you guys to stop and listen to this clip, and I'll explain to you guys afterwards what the history of libraries and African Americans and how it influenced us around the world. At the end of the 18th century, African Americans who could read were virtually non-existent, except for a few in northern and free states. In fact, those in power saw lack of education as the key to slaves' continuing subordination. In what became a social, economic, and political mandate, the education of slaves were prohibited by law in all southern states before the Civil War, with the exception of Tennessee. Slaves who could read did so in secret, and they made little progress in their efforts to increase the reading levels of others. Slaves and free men in northern states had a variety of ways of learning to read, often supported by the law. A New York state law required that a slave be taught to read by its master the Bible by the age of 18 or be set free. And as a result, church-related and Sunday schools became very popular, using the Bible as the foundation. Sunday schools in 1803 began to teach children and eventually adults to read and write. At the turn of the century, blacks who lived in most major northern cities were still prohibited from using libraries or participating in literary activities. They formed their own. During a period of self-actualization that began in 1828 and lasted for almost 100 years, more than 50 African American literary and library societies were founded in northern cities. Although it was soon evident that states were not providing equal services, it took many years to amass enough evidence to successfully challenge the separate but equal premise. However, prior to Plessy versus Ferguson, libraries were not segregated. African Americans were simply excluded altogether, except to either return or collect materials for white patrons. In the South, they were more constrained by the political systems than in the North, but eventually important barriers to access were slowly being removed. Plessy versus Ferguson was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation laws for public facilities as long as the segregated facilities were equal in quality. The doctrine that came to be known as separate but equal. In 1896, the Supreme Court upheld the separate but equal facilities as constitutional in Plessy versus Ferguson, which justified the creation of segregated public spaces for African Americans, which include schools and libraries. Scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, then a professor at Atlanta University and a strong proponent of African American education, spoke out publicly about the injustice of public facilities that refuse service to full third of Atlanta's population. In 1905, Louisville, Kentucky would open the first free public library for African American readers, staffed and operated entirely by African Americans. So now you know. Again, when we know better, we do better. When someone asks you what was the first African American library in the United States, we can say it was in Philadelphia. So that's pretty cool information. I didn't know that. When I know something, guess what I do? I share it with you guys. I love that. Now keep in mind that the history just explained that we had to have secret societies in order for us to learn to read. Now back in the 90s, I think it was, Oprah Winfrey made the book clubs really popular. Well, let's retract that, because as much as we like to believe that Oprah was responsible for a book club, she actually just re-engineered it in a modern state. Because honestly, we was the original culture that created a book club, because it really was the only way that we would have access to learning, is that we helped one another. When one learned to read, they would teach another to read. Do y'all see that connection? Do y'all see why I'm doing what I do? Community, connection, y'all getting it? This is all for free, because I want to educate us, because when we know better, we do better, right? Okay, so we're also the only culture in the world that was left to not be taught, to educate ourselves, or someone to teach us. That was taken away from us. So when someone asks our kindergarten daughter, why is it important that you learn the significance of a library? Well, she needs to understand why. She needs to understand where we started, so that she can understand why she gets to walk freely into a library and grab a book that wasn't always an option for us. So I love that. You know, I'm always trying to educate. I have some wonderful community stories, but I don't want to do them alone. So I had to tell you this story too. I grew up here on Long Street, right down the street at 1261. We're at the 1600 block. What was really cool about it was that I was always here. I was pretty much like that kid that just liked to read. As you guys know, I always loved history. I always loved visualizing things, which made reading easier for me. But my brother was such a part of the community. While I'm in the library, he's out gathering with everybody. So when we're talking about history, I sort of know the lame stuff. I know, like the libraries and the hospitals and the schools. But he knows all the fun stuff. So I'm gonna have him come along on the journey with me. We're just gonna talk a few minutes about our neighborhood that we grew up in, who we knew lived here, who we knew lived there, and just share with you guys our community experience. Do you guys mind going on the journey with me? I need some thumbs up or something. Give me some thumbs up, give me some love, give me something. Just a little bit, just a little bit. It's my brother Bobby. Everybody say hi. Everybody say hi. He is, how old are you now?
I'll be 54 in December.
And he was born in?
1965.
So I was born in 69 when this library was built. But this was the only library that I remember. Do you remember the other library?
I don't remember the old library, no. I remember this one mostly.
The first library was built in 1953. So this one was 69, so you would have been a baby.
Yeah,
so
I was very young. No, I've been very, very young. Not young enough, not old enough to go to the library just yet.
Okay. What was your memory of the library? I hope not getting kicked out.
No, I was always part of the group that was the loud group, of course. Hence why I'm so loud now. But my main focus on this library, the greatest memory I have is my Boy Scouts used to meet here every week. And that was the biggest focal point of the library. I wasn't very much of a reader. I was one that couldn't sit still very long enough.
But you were very social.
Right.
Which that is what I admire now, because when we're talking about these history stories, he remembers way more than me, and I'm so sad.
But you remember the foundation of the topics, though.
Lucky. I'm so lucky. I'm so lucky. I think one of the other things before we leave the library topic is the library when we were younger was a resource of like computers, because we didn't have access to a computer when we were kids.
But all we had, oh my God, the computer, I mean, as far as being introduced into my life was through the library.
Well, I think also, and I think we've got a clip of it and we're going to run through it, but some of the resources that was really cool. Remember we used to put on those big headsets?
Yes.
And it was
The big blue and white ones.
they were real big. That's all I remember, just because they were really the headsets that we use now, right? The little ones.
The earbuds.
They're just earbuds.
They were the earbuds of the day.
Just to avoid other people hearing your story, because you were listening to another story than I was, right?
Right. Because you got to understand, I am the king of useless information. So I would get on microfilm, which was, I mean, in that
Tell
day.
them about what microfilm is.
Microfilm is, it was the computer of the day. And literally you would have to take reels of 35 millimeter film and run it through a projector, and you would have to wind the stories, and you literally have to look for the stories on the microfilm.
And you would do that in order to, because so that we can explain it. It was almost captured.
Yes.
And then once it was captured, in order for us to look at it again, we had to go through this microfiche that allowed for you to see it again.
Yes.
So you guys get to just go to Google. We had to go to a library in this special room that was dark.
And you had to have a librarian find the actual reel, because they had drawers full of reels of 35 millimeter. And anybody of that age, knows 35 millimeter. It's film, just very, not that wide, but would hold a lot of information.
Well, I think one of the things also before we leave is to talk about index cards. Do you remember index cards?
Yes. Yes, do I remember the index cards. That was one of the first things that taught me how to remember things. Because I would look on the index cards, I'd be like, okay, I would have to run and go look. Wait a minute, go back, look. Oh my God, you guys have it so much easier.
So much easier. The index card you would pull out from this almost
Long
foul
drawer.
cabinet. And it was all these cards that allowed for you to identify where the book was.
Yep.
You pulled the card out, or you wrote it down, you wrote the number down.
Right.
Then you went looking for that number.
Right.
Now you go to a computer inside the library, you plug the name in to the Google search, and then it tells you where the book is. You guys have it so much easier than us. And then you learned about the decimal system. That was what Sean just talked about. Yep. We learned about decimals just from using the library system.
Code, right.
So all of these things were coordinated together, I think, just like the community is. It's all coordinated together.
Yes.
Well, let's go see some of our community. We're on the east side of Columbus on Long Street, where we grew up. In the first place we thought that was pretty cool to take y'all to. So our relatives all lived up and down Long Street throughout our lives. You would have thought that there was no other street. I mean, I swear to you, if I started down there, I can tell you, my aunt lived there, my cousin lived there, my brother lived there, oh, my uncle lived there for a couple months. I mean, so one of the places, tell them about this place.
This place here was where my aunt and my cousin, with her kids, with her two boys at the time, they all lived in this house here. My aunt had the lower half, and my cousin and her two sons had the upper half.
No, they didn't. They all lived on the upper half.
Was it both on the upper half?
Yeah. So right now, this house is one house. After regentrification.
Okay, so this is all one house now.
It's one house now. When my aunt lived there, it was a double.
It was a double. Okay.
And they lived on the upstairs portion of the house. It was just someone else. Yeah. So that was pretty cool that your aunt lived right down the street from you. The home that she lived in has now been remodeled after regentrification. The reason why we're stopping and having these conversations and taking note of the library and other staple buildings in the community is because we lose these buildings to regentrification, or when the community begins to transition to something else, we lose our history. So it's me who I think it's really important that I stop and recognize the community I grew up in, because this may no longer exist in 10 years. Okay? This is why we do what we do, to take care of you.
I never knew there was a library, where the new one exists. I never knew there was one there.
There is. Before we leave, we're going to go to one more house that another aunt lived in. Follow us. Now, mind you, these two aunts are sisters, but they didn't live in these homes at the same time. One lived at one maybe in I was in high school, because I had my high school graduation party here in '87. You remember that?
Yep.
She lived here.
Very hot, right?
Well, yeah, because this was her doorway. So this right here was my aunt's house. She's no longer with us. Her name was Jenny, one of my favorite aunts. She was so funny. But this was one of the homes that she lived in. If you see here, again, it's now one home. At the time that she lived there, it was 3 homes. So again, after regentrification, things begin to change. And if we don't stop and take note of these particular historical homes, the architecture, the individuals who were responsible for creating the homes, we'll miss it. And we gotta claim this history. If it's not for us, for our children. Don't you think that's important?
I agree, because in order to know where we're going, we have to know where we came from.
Exactly. And I think that's so important.
Very important.
And you're so important to me. My brother. Love you.
Love you too.
All right, you guys. It's all about community, family, and connection is what we do. We're trying to provide you every week with a historical factor that'll add value to your life as well as your children's life. We do what we do because we love you. We'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.